My son. Before Judge Judy says anything, before this courtroom decides what kind of mother I am, AB want to confess myself. Yes, AB did it. I stole the money. The old widow's trembling voice echoed through the silent courtrooms. Her weak hands shook uncontrollably as tears rolled down her wrinkled face. I know, AB know, I have no right to stand here and call myself innocent. She slowly looked toward her son, couldn't hold eye contact for more than a second. The shame was too heavy. I carried you in my arms when you were a baby. AB stayed awake whole nights when you were sick. And today, her voice cracked painfully. Today your own mother is standing in court like a criminal. The audience became completely silent. Even Judge Judy stopped moving. The old woman wiped tears from her face with trembling fingers. Yes, AB stole that money. But believe me, not one single day passed without guilt eating me alive. She pressed her shaking hands against her chest. I tried to hide it. AB tried to convince myself I had no choice. But every night I prayed to God to forgive me. Then she looked directly at her son again, and this time her voice completely broke. I am ashamed of myself. I am ashamed that my own son has to look at his mother like this. You trusted me, and I destroyed that trust with my own hands. The son stayed silent, cold, emotionless, and honestly. That silence hurt more than screaming ever could. The widow lowered her head in humiliation. I know you probably hate me now, and maybe you should, because a mother is supposed to protect her child, not betray him. Tears fell onto the courtroom floor. I don't want sympathy. I don't want excuses. I just wanted the courage to finally tell the truth before I die. And then, with trembling lips and tears streaming down her face, old widow whispered the sentence that made the entire courtroom emotional. I am guilty, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting what I did to my own son.
This 80-year-old widow walked into court looking weak and harmless, but less than 30 minutes later she would confess a secret so horrifying. Even Judge Judy stopped speaking. Nobody in that courtroom was prepared for what they were about to hear. Not the lawyers, not the audience, not even her own son. Because at first, it looked like a simple money case. An elderly mother accused of stealing nearly $400,000 from her own family. And sitting across from her was the man suing her, her son. Successful, rich, calm, cold. But here's where things get disturbing. The moment this old woman entered the courtroom, something felt wrong. Not legally wrong, emotionally wrong. You know those moments where your instincts start screaming before your brain catches up. This was one of those moments, because the son didn't even look at his mother. Not once. No concern, no guilt, no sadness, nothing. And Judge Judy noticed it immediately. Now pay attention carefully, because this tiny detail becomes terrifying later. People hiding emotional pain usually steal unconscious glances at the person hurting them. But this man, he avoided eye contact completely, like he was afraid of something or someone. And then, old woman sat down, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold her cane. She looked terrified, not dramatic, not manipulative, terrified. And honestly, the courtroom started feeling uncomfortable before anybody even spoke. Because sometimes, human beings can sense hidden trauma without understanding why. Judge Judy opened the case file slowly, then paused. Interesting, very interesting. Because according to the documents, this 80-year-old widow had secretly transferred family assets after her husband's death. Nearly $400,000. And her own son was accusing her of fraud. But then Judge Judy asked one simple question. Did you transfer the money? And the old woman whispered, yes. The courtroom exploded instantly. People gasped. Somebody in the audience actually muttered, oh my God. But here's what nobody expected. The son smiled, not emotionally, not with relief, with satisfaction. And right there, Judge Judy knew something was deeply wrong, because sons don't usually look victorious watching their elderly mother collapse emotionally in court. Unless this case isn't really about money. And that's exactly when the atmosphere changed. Completely. Judge Judy leaned forward and asked the question that shattered everything. Why did you do it? The old widow looked toward her son for the first time. And what happened next chilled the entire courtroom, because her son refused to look back at her. Total emotional rejection. Cold, detached, almost hateful, and then old woman started crying. Not loud crying, not fake tears. The kind of crying people do when they've carried something unbearable for decades. Now, psychologically speaking, there's a moment when people hiding life-changing secrets finally realize they can't survive the lie anymore. And you can literally watch their body change. That's what happened here. The trembling stopped, her breathing slowed, and suddenly, this terrified old widow looked emotionally exhausted, like she'd finally reached the end. Then she whispered 8 words. That turned the courtroom completely silent. I lied for 42 years. Judge Judy froze. The audience froze. Even her own son stopped breathing, and then, old widow revealed a secret so devastating. Destroyed an entire family in seconds. Richard isn't my husband's son. Pure silence. One woman covered her mouth in shock. Another man whispered, no way. But here's where this story becomes truly terrifying, because the son didn't look surprised. He looked exposed. And at that exact moment, Judge Judy realized this family had been hiding something much darker than an affair. Something poisonous. Something buried for over 4 decades. And trust me, what came next was so disturbing. Even Judge Judy struggled to respond, because hidden inside this family was a dying father's letter, a secret inheritance, a decades-old betrayal, and one horrifying truth that would completely destroy everything this man believed about his entire life. Richard Whitmore stopped breathing for a second. Not metaphorically, literally. The color drained from his face so fast the audience visibly reacted. And suddenly, confident financial consultant who walked into court acting completely in control looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. Now, psychologically speaking, shock reveals itself before words do. The frozen blinking, the delayed breathing, the inability to immediately look at the source of the threat. Richard displayed all of it. And Judge Judy noticed instantly. The courtroom remained dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered, because everyone could feel it. This case had just transformed from a financial dispute into something deeply personal. Something explosive. Judge Judy slowly removed her glasses. A dangerous sign. Because when Judge Judy stops interrupting and starts observing quietly, it usually means she senses a much larger truth underneath the surface. Eleanor's hands were still trembling. But strangely, her posture looked lighter now, not happier. Freer. That's important, because long-term secrets create chronic tension in the body. And when those secrets finally escape, people sometimes physically change right in front of you. Judge Judy leaned forward slowly. Mrs. Whitmore. Her voice softened slightly. Explain exactly what you mean. Richard suddenly stood up. No. The entire courtroom turned toward him. Too fast, too emotional. Another huge psychological tell. People who fear exposure often try to regain control before details emerge. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed immediately. Sit down. But this has nothing to do with the case. Judge Judy's voice became ice cold. Sit down. And then, silence again. Richard slowly lowered himself back into his chair. But now his composure was gone. Completely gone. His fingers kept tightening against the edge of the table. His jaw flexed repeatedly. His breathing became uneven. And most importantly, he still refused to look directly at Eleanor. Now that mattered, because people who are blindsided by lies usually demand eye contact. But Richard avoided it. Almost like part of him already knew something. Judge Judy turned back toward Eleanor. How long has your husband been dead? 12 years. And he never knew? Eleanor immediately burst into tears again. No, the audience visibly reacted. One older man near the back shook his head slowly. And honestly, at this point, the courtroom wasn't judging her anymore. It was trying to understand her, because 42 years is an almost unimaginable amount of time to carry a lie. That kind of secret changes people psychologically. It rewires their entire emotional life. Judge Judy spoke carefully now. Who was Richard's biological father? Eleanor froze, completely, and this time, it wasn't guilt on her face, it was fear, real fear. Notice the difference. Guilt looks inward, fear looks outward, and Eleanor suddenly looked terrified of what would happen if she continued. Richard leaned forward sharply. No, there it was again. Panic. Judge Judy turned toward him immediately. You don't get to decide what she says, but she's confused. he snapped. The courtroom reacted instantly. That sentence changed everything emotionally. Because moments earlier, Richard wanted Eleanor treated as legally responsible for complex financial fraud. But now suddenly, she was confused. That contradiction was devastating. Judge Judy caught it instantly. "Oh, interesting," she said sharply. "So she's mentally competent enough to steal $400,000. She paused, but too confused to speak. Richard realized his mistake immediately. Classic courtroom error under emotional pressure. People protecting lies often contradict their own narratives when panicking, and Richard was panicking badly now. Eleanor looked physically shaken, but something inside her had clearly changed. Like after decades of silence, she'd crossed a point of no return. Judge Judy lowered her voice again. "Mrs. Whitmore, who was Richard's father?" The old woman stared at the table for several seconds, and then quietly whispered, "My husband's brother." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, whispers. One woman actually muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Richard immediately slammed both hands against the table. "That's a lie." But here's what made the moment psychologically disturbing. His reaction sounded terrified, not offended, terrified. Judge Judy stared at him carefully. "How would you know it's a lie?" And suddenly Richard went silent. Complete silence, because that question was devastating. If this revelation was truly impossible to him, why react so specifically? Why so emotionally? Judge Judy noticed it instantly. So did the audience. At this point, the entire courtroom could feel something deeper hiding underneath the confession. And honestly, Richard looked less like a betrayed son, and more like a man watching his entire identity collapse. Eleanor covered her face with trembling hands. "I never wanted him to know." Judge Judy's eyes narrowed slightly. "Him, meaning your husband?" Eleanor nodded. "And your brother-in-law?" Another pause, longer this time. Then Eleanor whispered, "He knew." Now the courtroom was completely hooked, because suddenly this wasn't just a hidden affair anymore. It was a secret multiple people had apparently protected for decades. Judge Judy leaned back slowly. And here's where her instincts really kicked in. Experienced judges learned to recognize something important. Family secrets rarely stay buried without cooperation, especially for 42 years, which meant somebody else had likely helped maintain this lie, maybe several people. Judge Judy folded her arms. Did Richard ever know? Eleanor's eyes immediately filled again. No. Richard laughed suddenly. But it wasn't normal laughter. It was sharp, unstable, almost desperate. Another huge psychological tell. People sometimes laugh under emotional overload when reality becomes too painful to process cleanly. Richard shook his head slowly. "This is unbelievable." But then, something happened nobody expected. Judge Judy noticed Richard wasn't denying the timeline or the possibility. He was only attacking Eleanor emotionally. That distinction mattered a lot because innocent people often attack facts. People hiding something attack credibility. Judge Judy looked directly at him. "When did you first suspect?" Richard froze instantly. The courtroom went silent again. And there it was, the question that cracked the entire emotional structure of the case. Because Judge Judy didn't ask if he suspected. She asked when, meaning she already sensed the answer. Richard's breathing became visibly uneven now. He rubbed his hands together nervously, then looked toward his attorney for help. Bad sign, very bad sign. Because confident plaintiffs don't suddenly seek rescue unless something unexpected is true. Judge Judy repeated the question. "When did you first suspect your father wasn't your biological father?" Richard swallowed hard, and for the first time since entering court, his eyes started watering. But here's the disturbing part. He still wasn't looking at Eleanor, almost like he blamed her for something far bigger than the lie itself. "Finally," he whispered, "when I was 16. Gasps spread across the courtroom again. Eleanor immediately started crying harder. Judge Judy's expression changed completely now, because suddenly the emotional power balance flipped. Richard wasn't just a cold son suing his elderly mother anymore. He was also a teenager who apparently spent decades carrying suspicion alone. And psychologically, that kind of unresolved identity trauma destroys people quietly. Judge Judy spoke carefully. "How did you suspect it?" Richard stared blankly ahead, then answered with a sentence so chilling. Even the audience stopped moving. "Because my father told me before he died." Pause. "That I was the family's punishment." Silent, pure silence. Eleanor looked horrified, like she just heard something she never imagined. Judge Judy didn't speak, nobody did. Because whatever Richard's father had meant by those words, it clearly destroyed this family long before anyone entered court. And suddenly, money lawsuit didn't feel important anymore. Not even close. But then Richard slowly reached into his briefcase, pulled out an old envelope, and said something that changed the entire direction of the case again. "He left me a letter." The courtroom froze, and Eleanor's face went completely pale. The old envelope looked ancient yellow edges, fold marks worn deep into the paper, the kind of envelope people keep hidden for decades because opening it means reopening pain. And the moment Richard placed it on the table, Eleanor stopped breathing normally. Her entire body tightened, not guilt this time, terror, pure terror. Judge Judy noticed immediately, and honestly, at this point the courtroom wasn't watching a legal case anymore. It was watching 42 years of emotional damage slowly explode in public. Richard stared at the envelope for several seconds before speaking again, and when he finally did, his voice sounded completely different, smaller, broken. Dad gave this to me in the hospital. The room stayed silent, no whispers now, no reactions, because everybody instinctively understood this letter mattered a lot. Judge Judy folded her hands carefully. When did he give it to you? The night before he died. Eleanor immediately shut her eyes, and right there, Judge Judy caught something important. Eleanor didn't look surprised the letter existed. She looked afraid of what was inside it. That distinction matters psychologically, because people hiding secrets often fear confirmation more than exposure itself. Richard carefully slid the envelope toward the bailiff. His hands were trembling now too. Interesting, because earlier Richard behaved coldly detached. But now, the emotional armor was cracking fast. Judge Judy opened the envelope slowly. The courtroom felt frozen. Even the audience leaned forward instinctively. And then, Judge Judy started reading silently. At first, her face remained neutral, professional controlled, but about halfway through the letter, something changed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then widened, just slightly, but enough for everyone watching to realize the contents were disturbing, very disturbing. Richard looked physically sick now, like he regretted bringing the letter into court but needed it anyway, needed someone else to finally see it. Judge Judy finished reading, then carefully placed the paper back inside the envelope, and for several seconds, she said absolutely nothing. Now that silence terrified the courtroom more than yelling ever could, because experienced judges rarely become speechless. Judge Judy finally looked toward Eleanor. Your husband knew, not a question, a statement. Eleanor slowly nodded while crying. Richard immediately looked up. Wait, that reaction mattered, because he looked shocked hearing Judge Judy confirm it. Meaning, even after 16 years with the letter, he apparently still didn't fully believe it. That's psychologically common in family trauma. People often carry painful information while emotionally refusing to accept it completely. Judge Judy spoke carefully now. He knew Richard wasn't biologically his. Eleanor whispered, yes, and he stayed anyway. Another nod. The audience visibly softened emotionally, because suddenly the story became far more complicated than betrayal. Now it involved sacrifice, maybe resentment, maybe punishment, maybe love twisted into something unhealthy over decades. Judge Judy leaned back slightly. What exactly does the letter say? Richard looked down at the table before answering. He wrote that my mother destroyed our family before I was born. The courtroom reacted instantly. Eleanor broke down completely. But Richard continued, like he'd rehearsed these words in his head for years. He said my uncle begged him not to leave her because she was pregnant. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed. Interesting, very interesting, because now another emotional layer appeared. Shame, not just secrecy, family shame. And historically, that kind of shame destroys families from the inside out, especially older generations. Richard swallowed hard. He wrote that every time he looked at me, pause, he remembered what happened. Silence, heavy silence. Eleanor covered her mouth while sobbing uncontrollably now. And honestly, at this point even the audience looked emotionally exhausted, because this wasn't courtroom drama anymore. This was inherited pain passing through generations. Judge Judy looked toward Richard carefully. And you carried this alone since you were 16. Richard nodded once. No arrogance left now. None. The wealthy, composed financial consultant from earlier had completely disappeared. In his place sat a wounded teenager trapped inside a grown man's body. That transformation was heartbreaking to watch. But then, Judge Judy asked the question that changed everything again. Why sue your mother now? Richard froze. Immediately, psychologically, that hesitation was enormous, because truthful motives usually emerge quickly. Hid motives require construction. Richard looked away. Bad sign. Judge Judy repeated herself. You waited decades. Why now? The courtroom could feel it again. That strange tension. Like something still wasn't fully explained. Richard rubbed both hands over his face slowly, then finally answered. Because she changed the will. There it was, the money. Back again. But now it felt different emotionally. Judge Judy opened another document from the file, and suddenly, her expression changed sharply, very sharply. because buried inside the paperwork was a detail nobody had discussed yet. A nursing home contract. Judge Judy looked up slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, are you currently in assisted living? Eleanor nodded weakly. And your son wanted control of your financial assets before the transfer. Silence. Richard immediately shifted in his seat. Another stress response. Judge Judy's eyes locked onto him now. Dangerous moment. Answer me. Richard inhaled slowly. Yes. And how much would your mother's care cost annually? No response. Judge Judy checked the file herself, then looked back up. Nearly $130,000 a year. The audience murmured immediately, because, suddenly, financial dispute looked very different. Judge Judy leaned forward slowly. So let me understand this. Her voice became colder. Your elderly mother transferred assets into protected accounts. Pause. After learning long-term care could consume most of her estate. Richard quickly interrupted. She hid money from me. But Judge Judy snapped instantly. From you. Silence. And then, emotional atmosphere shifted again. Because now the courtroom began questioning something much darker. Was Richard really suing over betrayal? Or inheritance? Psychologically, money disputes inside wounded families often mask deeper emotional motives. And Judge Judy knew it. Richard suddenly looked defensive. Too defensive. My father wanted me protected. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed sharply. Protected from what? And suddenly, Richard said something so revealing the entire courtroom felt it instantly. From her. Eleanor collapsed emotionally hearing that sentence. Not angry, dieted, because right there became painfully obvious. This family had spent decades poisoning itself with silence. But then Eleanor whispered something nobody expected. He wasn't protecting you from me. Richard looked up immediately. The old woman's face had completely changed now. No fear, no hesitation, just grief, deep grief. And then she said quietly, he was protecting you from your real father. The courtroom froze solid. Richard's entire body stiffened instantly. Judge Judy stared at Eleanor carefully, because whatever she was about to reveal clearly terrified everyone involved. Even now, after 42 years, and then Eleanor whispered, your uncle wasn't a good man. Silence. Pure silence. And suddenly, entire story changed again. The courtroom stopped feeling like a courtroom. It felt like a confession chamber. Heavy, airless, emotionally dangerous. Eleanor Whitmore sat trembling at the plaintiff's table, tears running silently down her face while Richard stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time in his life. And honestly, maybe he was, because family secrets don't just hide facts. They erase identities. And what Judge Judy was witnessing now wasn't simply a legal dispute. It was the collapse of an entire emotional reality. Eleanor slowly wiped her eyes, then looked directly at Richard, really looked at him, probably more honestly than she ever had before. And when she spoke again, her voice sounded fragile enough to break. Your uncle hurt people. The room went still. Not normal silence, fear silence. Judge Judy didn't interrupt, didn't move, because experienced judges know something important. When trauma finally surfaces after decades, interrupting can shut it down completely. Eleanor continued carefully. He drank heavily. He fought constantly. Your father tried protecting the family from him for years. Richard looked frozen. Not angry now, confused. Overloaded, the psychological weight of his entire childhood was visibly crashing into him all at once. And honestly, that's exactly what happens when hidden truths suddenly rearrange old memories. Judge Judy folded her hands together. Did your husband know about the pregnancy immediately? Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes, and he stayed. Another nod. The audience reacted emotionally again, because suddenly Richard's father no longer looked like a bitter victim. He looked complicated, deeply complicated. A man who apparently chose to raise a child that wasn't biologically his, while silently carrying humiliation and resentment for decades. That emotional contradiction was devastating. Eleanor's breathing shook again. He told me he'd protect Richard no matter what. Richard immediately looked down, and for the first time, tears started falling from his face too. Not dramatic crying, silent crying, the dangerous kind. The kind men often hold inside for years until something finally breaks. Judge Judy noticed immediately, but then Eleanor whispered something that changed the emotional direction of the case again. He promised never to tell him. Richard looked up sharply. What? Eleanor nodded through tears. He swore to me he'd take the secret to his grave. The courtroom visibly reacted, because now the letter made less sense emotionally. If Richard's father promised secrecy, why leave the letter? Judge Judy immediately caught the contradiction. So why did he write this letter? Eleanor froze. And there it was again. Fear, not guilt. Fear. The audience felt it instantly, because whatever answer was coming, it clearly terrified her more than the affair itself. Richard wiped his face roughly, then whispered. He wrote it after the diagnosis. Judge Judy looked toward him. What diagnosis? Long pause. Then Richard answered quietly, Alzheimer's. The room went silent again. And suddenly, everything shifted. Because Alzheimer's changes memory, changes emotional control, changes truth. People living with degenerative illness sometimes release emotions they spent decades suppressing, sometimes accurate emotions, sometimes distorted ones. Judge Judy immediately understood the complexity now. The letter might not have been written by the same emotional man Eleanor described. It might have been written by someone already psychologically unraveling, and that possibility changed everything. Richard's voice cracked slightly now. He gave it to me after midnight. He stared blankly ahead while speaking. He said there were things I deserved to know before he forgot who I was. Several people in the audience looked visibly emotional, because suddenly the story became tragic from every angle. No villains, no heroes, just damaged people carrying unbearable emotional weight across generations. But then, Richard said something that made Judge Judy narrow her eyes sharply. He also told me to protect the family money. Interesting, very interesting, because right there, Judge Judy sensed the emotional conflict immediately. Richard wasn't only carrying trauma, he was carrying instruction, a mission. And psychologically, people raised inside emotionally fractured families often confuse loyalty with control. Judge Judy leaned forward carefully. What exactly did he mean by protect the money? Richard inhaled deeply, then answered. He said my mother couldn't be trusted when she was afraid. Eleanor immediately shook her head. No, but Richard continued. He said guilt made her irrational. That sentence hit hard, because emotionally manipulative families often weaponize guilt across generations. And now the courtroom could finally see how this family poisoned itself slowly over decades. Not through screaming, through silence. Judge Judy looked toward Eleanor again. Why did you transfer the money? The old widow closed her eyes, and then finally, real truth began surfacing. Not the affair, not the paternity secret, the deeper truth underneath all of it, Eleanor whispered. Because Richard's father begged me to. The courtroom froze. Richard stared at her in disbelief. What? Eleanor nodded weakly. 3 months before he died. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed sharply now, because this directly contradicted the emotional meaning of the letter. Interesting. Extremely interesting. Eleanor reached slowly into her purse. Her trembling hand searched carefully through old papers, receipts, photographs, comms, medical forms. And then, she pulled out a folded document, old, worn it many times. She passed it carefully toward the bailiff. Judge Judy opened it slowly, and within seconds, her expression changed completely. Shock, actual shock. The courtroom noticed immediately. Richard noticed too. What is that? Judge Judy stared silently at the page for several moments before answering. It's a notarized financial instruction. The room reacted instantly. Eleanor whispered through tears. Your father made me promise. Richard looked physically sick now. Judge Judy continued reading silently. And honestly, the deeper she read, more emotionally disturbing the story became. Because according to the document, Richard's father feared something very specific before his death. Something connected to Richard himself. Judge Judy finally looked up slowly. This says your husband instructed Eleanor to move most of the estate into protected trusts. Pause. Specifically preventing direct access by Richard. Silence exploded across the courtroom. Richard immediately stood up again. That's impossible. But his voice cracked badly now. Judge Judy's expression hardened instantly. Sit down. Richard obeyed immediately this time. No fight left. None. Judge Judy continued. The document specifically states, she looked down again, that these protections should activate if Richard became financially unstable or emotionally aggressive. The audience gasped loudly. Richard looked completely shattered, because suddenly, his father's final message wasn't protection for him. It was protection from him, and psychologically, that realization destroyed him instantly. No, he whispered. Judge Judy stared carefully at the document again, then at Richard, then back at Eleanor. And suddenly, something clicked in her mind, a pattern, a very dangerous pattern. Because emotionally controlling people often accuse others of manipulation while secretly acting manipulatively themselves. Judge Judy leaned forward slowly. Richard, his eyes